There's a formula to it. A very simple formula.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Slash Up Podcast. My name is Jared, and yes, today we are talking about Night of the Living Dead. I know, it's very interesting. Night of the Living Dead is a very culturally significant movie, especially considering the zombie fanatic that happened during the, early 2000s, late 2010s, pretty much till now. Zombie fatigue is started to roll around now, so it's not as prominent, but during the 2000 to 16, 17, it was the genre of horror movies, and it changed, and now it changed. But all of that started with a very, very special movie called Night of the Living Dead. It is one of the most important movies to the horror genre as a whole, considering how far past the horror genre this movie has brought its significance, I guess is the way to put it. Well, yeah, so Night of the Living Dead was created, written, and directed by George Romero. It was him and one of his friends who's also in the movie. They made this idea they were not zombies. He did not make zombies when he was making this movie. He wasn't thinking about zombies when he was creating this movie. He was thinking of, in an interview, he said that they're just their neighbors. They're not murderers, psycho murderers. They're just people. They're just like people that died and came back. So he wasn't thinking of zombies in the way that we think of zombies now. That was kind of a development past what his main idea was. But for now, the zombies genre at that point of Night of the Living Dead did not exist. He created the monstrosity, like the monster that was zombies and is zombies now. You think of horror genre, and a lot of people would think about zombies, and all of that leads back to Night of the Living Dead and all of the sequels, but I'm not going to be talking about all of the sequels in this movie because there's 4 like on the story, and then there's more than that, but there's a few in the storyline. Night of the Living Dead was created, I think it was 63, somewhere in the 60s. It was one of the most influential movies at the time. You can consider a lot of things when you look at the metaphors that could have been placed in the movie, even though George Romero said that the most common ending metaphor was not his intention, but he understands that the movie kind of ran out of his own understanding. Like he kind of gave the movie away to that metaphor when he understood he probably wrote it subconsciously around this idea that we'll talk about later. So for now, let's just get into the story of Night of the Living Dead. So the movie begins with one of the most common and referenced moments of horror cinema is, so these 2 brothers and sisters are driving up into their cemetery to see their father. I think they're brothers, or brother and sister, sorry. And they're driving up to go see their dad. I think it's their dad. All of a sudden, a zombie shows up and it kills the brother. Spoiler alert. Barbara, if you've ever heard the line, "They're coming to get you, Barbara," that comes from this movie at this scene. So the most important part to understand is this movie, it takes place pretty much in one central location. It kind of leads up to one spot and then stays there. So we get Barbara, and Barbara ends up in this house with this man. I forget who's Dwayne Jones. He's played by Dwayne Jones. And her name is Judith O'Dea, I think is how you pronounce her last name. I'm not absolutely sure. So they basically end up in the same house, and zombies are attacking the house because they know that they're in there. And we basically get this weird dynamic that tries to it kind of feels like it's trying to explain how humans would react in a situation where there are zombies constantly coming from, like, underneath them, not underneath them, but, like, attacking their house and, like, attacking them. That's what it feels like, because a lot of Night of the Living Dead takes place in one house and kind of explains the different ways that people react to these, terrifying situations. So what we understand is the movie's not taking place in a multiple location place. It takes place in one spot. So our characters, Dwayne Jones, Ben, and then Barbara, are coming to this house, and there's a family in the basement, and they end up not being very happy with the idea of them being upstairs. They want to stay downstairs. And then, so what happens is one of the youngest daughter is sick from the virus that is causing the zombies. She gets the zombies and she pretty much just beats her mom over the head with like a garden spade, which is really the only like really like terrified like murder kind of feeling to it. Everything else feels like zombies for the most part, but that one is using a garden spade to kill her mom, and that's just terrifying. So at the end of that, they kind of come back upstairs, and so they kill a lot of the zombies, and they end up blowing up a lot of the zombies for a reason. There's a gas station, gas can thing nearby. They blow it up and kind of like attract all the zombies to it, and it blows up. So they basically go from there, and then they go back to their main house and discuss how they're going to like survive after that. But that's when the zombies start overtaking the house. So they have to run into the basement, which is funny because he's been arguing about never going into the basement this entire time, using it as like a backup. That way they have room to run somewhere. Whether if you're in the basement already, you can't run anywhere. So he ends up having to be pushed into the basement because the zombies are attacking the building. So after they attack the building, he has to go and save. He tries to like pretend and like watch for the people that are in the basement still, but it turns out that they were all infected by the little girl. Because after you die, you basically revive. It doesn't work like in a lot of zombies movies where you have to be eaten or scratched or bit. You pretty much just die and you come back, from what I'm able to remember and what I'm able to tell about this movie. Another important thing to understand is you don't just die. You die and come back immediately after, pretty much, or like a set period of time. He has to end up killing the zombie version of the guy that was downstairs with his family, and then the wife, and then the kid. They're all zombies down there, and he has to hide up there for a really long time. He hides there for the rest of the night because it's probably 1 a.m. at this point. He stays until daytime when he hears people outside. And we're getting into the ending of this movie, so if you aren't interested in any more spoilers that I've already spoiled, don't watch anything else. Just don't listen to this. Go watch the movie and come back if you would like, so I can talk about it and you can listen to it, because I like talking about this movie. So the ending of this movie is Ben comes upstairs, and so there's this group of like militia, I guess is the way to put it, that are going around during the daytime shooting all of the zombies that they see, trying to like rid themselves of this virus, So basically what happens is the militia see Ben in the house coming up out of the cellar, and he stands there, and they think that he's a zombie, and they shoot him dead. They basically shoot him dead, and then the movie ends. So Night of the Living Dead's amazing ending, Ben is killed by this militia. And I will discuss why that is important later. I left out some details about certain characteristics of Ben because it's not important to the story. But when we talk about metaphors and how the movie could be interpreted and how it was interpreted, I will explain more then. For now, I want to talk about something that I find very interesting. So George Romero's Night of the Living Dead is shot in black and white. So black and white is cheaper to shoot on film than it is to shoot color film. And since they were a low budget film, they wanted to get as much money, save as much money certain places as they could. So they used black and white black and white film to shoot their movie instead of using colored film because it was cheaper to shoot on black and white film. So if you watch this movie and you watch I think there's another movie, some other horror movie, like Psycho for example. Psycho was shot in black and white, I think to save money too. So if you look at Psycho, it's black and white. This is during the 60s. And then you watch Night of the Living Dead, they're both shot in black and white. When the normality at the time was colored film. But because the horror genre is a low budget film a lot of times, it seems like that was the norm. Like if you've only watched horror movies from the 60s, like you didn't watch any other other types of genres, you would think that the horror genre as a whole, like movies as a whole, was black and white, when it was an abnormality to see a black and white film in the theaters because it was never produced like that anymore. which I think is really interesting because we don't really have everything's shot on digital now. It's pretty much cheaper to use digital, I'm sure, than black and white photo at this point because it's just a higher quality for, not as much. So I don't know if there will ever be a similarity to how you use digital versus film, because film is more expensive from what I understand. Film is more expensive to shoot on than digital because digital is easier to use, but film produces better quality overall because you can upgrade film to look better. Digital is pretty much shot at a certain rate and then kept that way. So I don't know if we'll ever have a direct 1-to-1 ratio of like film is better than digital, and if black and white photo and color photo film. I don't know if we'll ever have that again where you shoot on one, you shoot on the other because it's cheaper than the other and it looks visually different, because film and digital look very similar and you can only really tell a little bit if you're paying a lot of attention to it, which is not completely the norm. So, we're going back to the ending of this movie. So, remember this was created during the 60s, during the height of the civil rights movements with Martin Luther King and, So, the ending was not intended to be what a lot of people understand the metaphor to be in this movie. So, remember the ending, what I told you earlier? The ending of the movie, he gets killed, right? I left out a part of this movie that is important to understand the metaphor. Ben is a person of color, and it's a militia who is, police brutality. Whether you understand how important that metaphor is, you need to understand that it's an important part of this movie. Like, that's why we understand this movie now and pay so much attention to it, because the metaphor that we took from it, whether or not it was meant to be there or not, is very, very vital to that period of time, because that period of time was wrapped around the civil rights movements. To understand why we need that and why that happened, we can understand that the movie was not intended to be the way it was, but it also brings up an interesting idea. Can art truly be your own when you create it? Or is it you're giving your art to someone else to interpret, right? So, George Romero, he created Night of the Living Dead because he knew he had a good idea for it. However, people took his ending and brought this metaphor to it that, in my opinion, made the movie better, considering the time that it was created. George Romero picked Duane Jones, if that's how you pronounce his first name, not because he was a person of color, just because he did the best job in the acting. Like his interview or role audition, yeah. He did the best job, right? So we get him in this role as the protagonist of the movie, pretty much. Because he was not ever written to be a person of color, and George Romero did not rewrite his character to be a person of color too, once Duane Jones was on the role. That is why this is one of the first movies to have a person of color in such a, personal, big part of the movie. It's not that it's never happened before this, but this was, the most important part. And most important movie that happened with this movie. The most important role for someone was this movie. Because no one really did that before this point. Especially, it's important to understand, he did not change a single way about how his character was written. It was written, and it stayed the same way it was when George Romero casted Duane Jones. So we get him understanding that the movie kind of took its own way from him and his understanding of what the movie meant to him by not changing the script, by casting Duane Jones, and by the ending. The ending, now when you look back at it, with it being Duane Jones, it looks like the metaphor was absolutely intended, but it wasn't. It was meant to just be a dreary, sad ending, a shock ending, quote unquote. So we need to understand that, but again, like I said earlier, this is what brings up an interesting understanding of what is art. Art is not your own once you create it. It is up for other people to interpret your art. So can you really ever fully put a metaphor into your art and have it someone else understand it when you tell it again? Which I don't think you can, because the only way that you can accept that your metaphor exists in the way it does is if someone else interprets your art the way you did or asks you about the metaphor you had in your art. That's why when people ask George Romero about his ending, he says, I did not intend this ending to be the way it was, but he also understands that the ending that happened in this movie was not his intention, but it was for the best at the time. Like, it created a sense of understanding of people, what they go through on a daily basis. It's used in, it's like the metaphor around Night of the Living Dead, when you look at it, it seems interesting because he uses, like corpses as just regular human beings, kind of. It's not like zombies where they're just murderers and ravages. They do that in this movie a lot, but it's not the same. You'll watch the movie and you'll understand what I mean. It's not the same thing as it is in other movies. But he also uses it not as a bad thing. Like, their zombies are just humans that are eating people. It's less like creatures. Like, they're not creatures like they are in The Walking Dead, for example. They're just humans that are eating people. Because earlier, there's the girl who stabs the spade into her mom. That would only happen in a movie where the zombies were just humans, not creatures. So if you want to know more about this, which I do intend that you would really, if you do enjoy horror movies as a whole, I would suggest looking up more about the metaphor and around the time that Night of the Living Dead was created and the social impact that this movie had around that point. Because it is very important to understand what it did with politics at the time, and now how it helped define the horror genre as a whole with zombies, which I think is very cool that a movie that is so politically charged in our metaphor taking of it, and a movie that is such a staple for the horror genre are one and the same. So we're going to get to a very important aspect of this. This is the fifth point in this tiny little podcast. So starting the zombies genre as its entirety, what is, this movie started the entire zombie genre. So, it started here, Night of the Living Dead. Pretty much it did not exist before this movie. So it would take a few years after this movie for zombies to become such a staple in how, when you look at it now, and how you look at zombies now, the creatures, the people, the corpses, mangled and all disgusting or whatever. That didn't happen for a few years after Night of the Living Dead. In some of the sequels later on, Night of the Living Dead did become like that. There was a lot of the murders and the disgusting bits of people. That happened later, but in Night of the Living Dead, it was not how it was. So this movie spawned what pretty much... So there was a lot of the, there was the creature features, there was the slasher films, but during this time, this movie kind of shot the horror genre into a new direction, because Night of the Living Dead became so popular, and it's so, understandably important to culture and the horror genre. So it's not it's not misunderstood to say that this movie is vitally important to filmmaking as a whole. The way he shot this movie was really never done before, because it was so low budget. He kind of shot it by himself. There was him and probably a few other people, but pretty much if there was a makeup designer, they were also in the movie. If there was a costume designer, they were also blah 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 character number 7. If they were a cameraman, they were also, Barbara's brother. I think Barbara's brother was the co-writer or something. So pretty much you had 10 jobs if you were in Night of the Living Dead, which that is important to understand because that is what made the horror genre so vitally acceptable and easily creatable, and why it shot that genre into the atmosphere, because you can understand that you can make a movie like Night of the Living Dead with 6 people. You did not need to have 45, 50, 60, 100, 200, 300, 400 people in order to make a scary horror movie. You could have 6 people who do different jobs. So we need to understand that that is how what this movie created was more of the accessibility to filmmakers to make movies by themselves independently, rather than with, having 1,000 people around you, creating you, telling you what to do, what you have to do, what you need to create, what you need to invent. So, in order to understand that completely, the zombies genre, it's like, we'll take this movie for example. I'm looking at the poster, it's on my wall right now. I don't know why you needed to know that, but you do, apparently. It's on my wall. Blair Witch Project. So we're going to take a look at the Blair Witch Project and how I kind of relate them both, because they're kind of somewhat shot similarly to each other. So the Night of the Living Dead has some cinematic moments to them that are purely cinematic, but a lot of the shots feel like you're in the movie. And there's one movie that everyone points to when they're talking about found footage. That is the Blair Witch Project. The Blair Witch Project was shot entirely by 3 people by themselves completely. And that is what I'm telling you. This movie, Blair Witch Project is one of the biggest horror movies at the time ever. Night of the Living Dead is one of the biggest horror movies of all time. They were both shot with very, very minimal people. That is not something that happened back then. So, for example, if you've seen Pulp Fiction before, I'm just telling you about this. It's kind of an interesting fact. Quentin Tarantino was on the set of that movie, and he was just kind of filming some behind-the-scenes stuff. And Bruce Willis said that, give it a few years and there will be a movie written and shot with that, will be shot on that camera, which is just like a regular handheld camera. And 3 years later, the Blair Witch Project comes out and destroys the box office and pretty much sets itself as a culturally significant movie to the horror genre. That was only 3 years later. And that is important to understand because Night of the Living Dead was not a movie that had that idea. It wasn't something that, hey, this will happen eventually, right? So that's why Night of the Living Dead is put even higher above the Blair Witch Project in a lot of people's brains, because someone just created Night of the Living Dead. The Blair Witch Project kind of was always, even though the Blair Witch Project is really good, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. I have a lot to talk about the Blair Witch Project, so that'll be a different podcast. But even though the Blair Witch Project has a lot of story to it, it is not as vitally important to the genre as a whole as Night of the Living Dead is, even though it's set its own subgenre of horror, which I can't talk about right now, because it'll be a 45,000-minute podcast. So, Night of the Living Dead kind of set itself apart from the rest of horror movies by the way that it introduced and used the main characters. So, we get these their entirety is important, the whole movie is important to the horror genre as a whole. So we're going to be moving on to the next point here, because it's kind of where I'm going with this next and what I was kind of talking about. Night of the Living Dead was vitally, vitally, vitally important to low-budget filmmaking, which nowadays is different than it was then. So Night of the Living Dead, shot on film, with big cameras, shot with on sets and shot on those kind of things, right? Nowadays, it's a little different. You can just pick up your iPhone, point it, say, go. And, you make an entire movie like that. Back then, it was a little harder to do. But what's vitally important about Night of the Living Dead is because of how they shot Night of the Living Dead and how it became, such a vitally important movie, we can now create movies on our iPhones that people won't look down at us for, because it's, look at what Night of the Living Dead did. So this movie can be just as good as Night of the Living Dead, even though it's not the same thing, if that makes any sense. Because I kind of understand it. It's like, so Night of the Living Dead did what it did. And if Night of the Living Dead didn't do what it did, we wouldn't be able to create films so easily anymore because on our iPhones, because people wouldn't understand them completely. Night of the Living Dead is one of the most important horror movies to the genre as a whole. If you have never seen Night of the Living Dead, go watch it as soon as you possibly can. It is one of the best horror movies of all time, in my opinion. It's one of the best horror movies. Not scary, there's a difference. I'm not scared by Night of the Living Dead. I just understand its significance to the horror genre is just the same as the classic Universal monsters, which a lot of people will probably hate me for saying, but I think they're just as important to each other as the horror genre is to the Universal monsters. Like, if we got the Universal monsters, then we got Night of the Living Dead. Both of them, all of those together created the horror genre that we got now. And it's still an ever-evolving genre. The horror genre is not a very structured formula like a lot of other genres are. It's such a creative and innovative genre of filmmaking. Like, we get movies like Host, I think it's called Host, which is entirely shot during COVID-19, which I'm going to get, I just got, taken down. No one's going to ever see this podcast. But during, the Big Sick, they shot this horror movie called Host. And it was all shot basically from Zoom, which if you've seen movies like Friend Request, I think it's called Friend Request, and Unfriended, that's the movie. That movie was also shot in like a Zoom style meeting. I think it was Skype, basically. And if we didn't get those type of movies, like, those are the kind of movies that you get from a culture that it values innovation from the norm. Like, horror movies after, like, Halloween, because we did get a lot of slashers during the 80s, but if horror wasn't a genre that was allowed to evolve, we would still just be getting slasher over slasher after slasher after slasher, and not get movies like Hereditary or Midsommar that are so vitally different from that kind of idea. So, I am going to end this podcast here. Thank you very, very much for watching. I am having a blast talking about this movie. I love Night of the Living Dead. If you weren't able to tell from this, podcast, I love Night of the Living Dead. I think it's one of my favorite horror movies. It's so interesting, vitally, to the horror genre as a whole that I think it's important to watch and to value its creation. George Romero is a vitally important filmmaker. If you haven't seen The Amusement Park on Shudder, which I'm not sponsored by Shudder, but if you haven't seen it and you do have Shudder, because I can't say go buy Shudder because I'm not sponsored, so I'm not going to do that. But if you have Shudder already and you haven't seen George Romero's lost movie, The Amusement Park, go see it as soon as you can. It is on par with the metaphors that are in Night of the Living Dead, just about elderly abuse and how society treats elderly people. It's important to watch, especially if you're young. Watch it. You will understand and be able to empathize with elderly people more than you would be otherwise. So we're going to end the podcast here. If you are new, please consider subscribing. I'm having a great time, and I would love to be able to share this with as many people that want to sit here and listen to me talk, because I love talking. I'm making a lot of videos recently. I have written a few scripts, so bite-sized analysis videos will be coming out soon. Go follow me on Twitter, @slashithorror. Instagram is @slashithorror too. It's @slashithorror, not @slashithorror2. Just @slashithorror. Follow me on Twitch too. That is @slashithorror as well. I have something called Horror for Charity coming up. You will understand what that is soon, hopefully, or you will have already known what it is, depending when I release certain information. which there is some videos on my channel already about horror for charity. So I don't know if it's happened yet when I release this podcast. I'm not sure, but probably not. This will probably come out very, very soon. Those dates are August 16th through the 20th, if I'm remembering correctly. So please come out for that. We are supporting, raising funds for mental health organizations. Our goal is $200. There's merch, which hasn't been announced or released yet. You can see pictures of it, but you can't buy it yet. All proceeds from the merch goes directly to the charity that I'm donating for, Mental Health of America. So yeah, thank you for watching, everyone. I'm changing kind of what I say at the end of these. I say, remember to treat me like Halloween or whatever. I have something important to tell, change here. So my new saying is, remember that success only comes to those that dare to attempt.